Hello, this is Tony Hiller from RealClimateScience.com, the climate guy setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I discuss the increase in snow, ice, and fraud by climate scientists. Exact opposite of news reports, there's been a large increase in the amount of ice in the Northern Hemisphere this year. This has been accompanied by an equally large increase in the amount of deception and fraud by climate scientists. Before I jump into the current state of the Arctic, let's look at the forecasts that have been made over the last 10 years. March 1st, 2008, expert Arctic polar cap may disappear this summer. June 20th, 2008, National Geographic, North Pole may be ice-free for first time this summer. Arctic warming has become so dramatic that the North Pole may melt this summer. December 2007, could all Arctic ice be gone by 2012? Seth Borenstein, Associated Press. This week, after reviewing his own new data, NASA climate scientist Jay Zwally said, at this rate, the Arctic Ocean could be nearly ice-free at the end of summer by 2012. The Arctic is screaming, said Mark Cerise of the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. BBC, December 2007. Arctic summer is ice-free by 2013. Scientists in the U.S. have presented one of the most dramatic forecasts yet for the disappearance of sea ice. Their latest modeling studies indicate northern polar waters could be ice-free within 5 or 6 years. In the end, it will just melt away quite suddenly. You can argue that our projection of 2013 is already too conservative. Sierra Club, Canada, why Arctic sea ice will vanish in 2013. Nobel laureate Al Gore, polar ice cap may disappear by summer 2014. New computer modeling suggests the Arctic Ocean may be nearly ice-free in summer as early as 2014, Al Gore said today at the UN Climate Conference in Copenhagen. The Guardian, July 2013, ice-free Arctic in 2 years heralds methane catastrophe. The Guardian, 2016, next year or the year after, the Arctic will be free of ice. June 2008, James Hansen, NASA's top climate alarmist, the guy who started the global warming scam, said that in 5 to 10 years the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. Ed Markey, Democrat, Massachusetts, said, Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later, we recognize him as a climate prophet. Wow, these forecasts by top scientists look serious, and so many of them. And now let's look at the news from this past winter. The North Pole is 36 degrees warmer than normal. It must all be melted by now. North Pole disappearing, strange super hot temperatures, climate emergency, North Pole sees record temperatures. There can't be any ice left. All of these forecasts of doom started in 2007. Let's look at what Arctic ice has actually done over the past decade. This is the Arctic sea ice data since the end of August 2006 from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. Remember the people who said the Arctic was screaming. What their data shows is that there's been no trend in Arctic sea ice over the last decade. It's not increasing, it's not decreasing. Nothing is changing in the Arctic. This graph is also from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. It shows us that the Arctic melt season has ended and ice is starting to increase. It also shows that there's more ice now than 2007, 2011, 2012, 2015, 2016. There's also more ice than 2008, and there's more ice than 2010 as well. So there's actually more ice than there has been most years of the past decade. Additionally, Arctic sea ice is in the normal 2 standard deviation range marked by this gray band. There's nothing unusual going on in the Arctic. All these predictions of Arctic doom and all these news stories we've been looking at are simply fake news. They have nothing to do with science. People are simply making things up. It's science fiction. I'm going to come back to Arctic sea ice in a minute, but for now let's talk about the other aspect of Arctic ice, which is glacial ice. Here's an article from December of 2016 in the Washington Post. With enough evidence, even skepticism will thaw. As one of Greenland's largest ice shelves shrinks, a once doubtful scientist has come around to the role of climate change and melting it. Andreas Munchow had his doubts about whether warming temperatures were causing one of the world's great platforms of ice to melt and fall apart. The Petermann ice shelf lost another 2 Manhattans of ice in 2012, and Munchow decided to see for himself, launching a project to study the ice shelf intensively. We don't have to take anybody else's word about what's going on at the Petermann ice shelf. We can just look at NASA satellite imagery. So let's see what's gone on there since 2012. NASA satellite imagery shows that the Petermann ice shelf has been growing about 10 feet per day since 2012 when Munchow started his study. Let's look at that again. 2012, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. The ice shelf is growing really fast. What was Munchow talking about? The ice shelf isn't falling apart. It's growing quite robustly. This is all just fake news. Greenland has another very famous glacier called the Jacobshavn Glacier, and here's some more fake news from the Washington Post about it from last April. Scientists just uncovered some troubling news about Greenland's most enormous glacier, the Jacobshavn Glacier. It's going to raise sea level by more than 20 feet. All the usual nonsense from the Washington Post. So once again, let's look at NASA's satellite imagery of the Jacobshavn Glacier and see for ourselves what it's done over the last 5 years. This animation flashes back and forth between 2012 and 2017. And this is the glacier terminus right here. This was the position in 2012. This is the position in 2017. As you can see, the glacier has grown. It's moving towards the sea, not away from it. So contrary to the claims of the Washington Post, the Jacobshavn Glacier is growing, not shrinking. But it hasn't always been this way. Between 1851 and 1913, the Jacobshavn Glacier shrank about 10 miles. This was back when CO2 levels were below 300 parts per million. So at 300 parts per million CO2, the glacier was retreating, and at 400 parts per million, the glacier is growing slightly. Clearly, the behavior of the glacier has nothing to do with greenhouse gases. The Danish Meteorological Institute just issued a report showing that Greenland's surface gained a near-record 550 billion tons of ice over the last year, which was the 5th highest on record. Greenland isn't losing ice. Greenland is gaining ice. Greenland's ice is growing now, but it hasn't always been like this. In 1939, Sweden's top Arctic expert reported that all the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting. It may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers of Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of catastrophic collapse. And in 1952, America's top Arctic expert, Dr. William Carlson, said the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising the ocean levels. He said the glaciers of Norway and Alaska were only half the size they were 50 years ago. So they lost half their mass between 1900 and 1950 when greenhouse gases were very low. Clearly, the behavior of glaciers has nothing to do with greenhouse gases. So we've seen that Greenland's largest glaciers have grown over the last 5 years. Let's go back and see what sea ice has done over the last 5 years. I generated this map from imagery from the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. Green shows Arctic sea ice gain since 2012, and red shows loss. You can see that there's been a large increase in Arctic sea ice since 2012. The ice edge has expanded by several hundred miles over the last 5 years, as indicated by the green. Now let's look at what's happened over the past decade. The Arctic minimum extent has been increasing. This graph shows us the day of the year of the Arctic minimum. What it shows us is that the end of summer has been coming about 10 days earlier to the Arctic than it was a decade ago. The Arctic summers are getting shorter. The next graph shows us the average ice loss per day during the melt season. In 2008, they lost almost 60,000 square kilometers per day, but this year they lost closer to 50,000. So the amount of ice loss per day has dropped significantly over the past decade. So we've seen that both glacial ice and sea ice have been increasing over the last 5 years. What about snow cover? This graph is from the Rutgers University Global Snow Lab. It shows us the extent of snow cover during the fall in the Northern Hemisphere. What we can see from this graph is over the last 50 years, the area of land covered with snow during the autumn has increased by a large amount. Recent years have been at record high levels. What this indicates is that Arctic air is pushing further south in the autumn and causing precipitation to fall as snow rather than rain. And in winter, we're seeing exactly the same thing. Over the past 50 years, the area of land in the northern hemisphere covered with snow has been increasing, once again indicating that cold to Arctic air is pushing further south than it did 50 years ago. So we know that over the past 50 years, during the snow season of autumn and winter, cold Arctic air has been pushing further and further south than it used to. 10 years ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change wrote that the amount of snow and ice cover on the Earth was decreasing. That clearly isn't the case anymore. We've seen a long-term increase in the amount of cold season snow cover, and over the last 5 years, we've also seen glacier and sea ice increasing. Yet, despite all evidence to the contrary, fake scientists and fake news sources keep insisting that the Arctic is melting and that it's all going to disappear. There's no evidence to indicate that that's true. George Orwell said, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act." And that's exactly where we're at with climate. Almost everything you hear about in the press and from scientists about climate is fake news. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science for a long time.